Howdy, folks. Welcome back for part 2 of lecture number 22 in my Metal Gear Solid V Explained lecture series, where I'm going over missions 00, the prologue, and 46, the truth mission. Now, last time I left off, right before the scene in the lobby, after we've taken out the two guards before the lobby, there's this little cutscene that plays depicting a conflict between the two sides, between the XOF guys and Ishmael first. Now, Ishmael says here that, he's going to run a distraction for us. And the way he's going to do that is he takes the silencer off his gun and he throws the silencer. And as the silencer's in the air, there's this slow-mo as it's toppling end over end. And if you've seen the movie 2001, you know that that is a reference to the bone that is hooked up in the air by one of the monkeys in the beginning of the movie that is used for that very famous match cut to cut the bone in with a space station that they cut to later. And, it's like, tools through time. Kind of a crazy cut. But this slowdown of this tumbling, sort of monolithic looking thing going through the sky is kind of meant to recall 2001, I think. It's kind of a 2001 reference. And then he runs to the edge of the stairs while he's just shooting some blind shots, and then he jumps off. When he disappears below the staircase out of the scene, this guard, within about a second, gets there, is looking straight down, doesn't see him. It's like, where the heck did he go, If you go down there and look there yourself, there's not really any space he could have gone and just hidden in. Now, what I think happened, if you want to be realistic about it and say he didn't use any teleportation or zero shift stuff, which probably is what's going on with the whole slow motion during his jump and all of that. But another way to look at it is one of those blue beds is there and there's a door there. What if he jumped off of that staircase? I used to think this. He jumped off the staircase, hit the bed, and rolled through an open door. And as he gets through it, the door shuts. If that had happened, though, I'm pretty sure that guard that was shooting at him in the lobby would have been able to see it and would have just kept shooting at him. So, the whole thing seems staged in a way so as to suggest that Ishmael's literally teleporting out of nowhere, And again, I think that's just a reference to zero shifts and all of that kind of zero genetics. So then that's that scene, and then you get control. And you have to shoot all the guys in the lobby or avoid them. And then once you do that, another cutscene plays. And this one depicts another conflict between the man on fire and the XOF guys. So it's a conflict between sides that have been sort of coming at us, but we know they're kind of separate, right? And so it's not really a conflict with us, but we do see that before all this conflict happens, Venom's sitting here staring at the scene, and then the camera pans over around this column that's blocking part of his body, and we see Mantis is floating in the air right next to him and has got the Archaea horn. So what happens next that Mantis is recreating is coming from Venom's own memories and his wishes, sort of, right? And what happens is the man on fire walks down the stairs and stands there, and these five guys are kind of not sure what to do, and then they start shooting at him, and then they get burned, and he does a whole rage kind of thing and explodes and just murks all the rest of the guards in the lobby. I think that's indicative of the Fury and his genetics and the fire and all of that. The way we see the Fury act in his boss fight. It's kind of reminiscent of this. You can think of the bats that he torches in that scene as kind of like these XOF soldiers here. Now these guys, these XOF guards, soldiers, I should say, are probably, like I said, stand-ins for Zero's guards back then. There's another blue wheelchair here in this lobby, and there's a couple more leading up to here that I haven't mentioned. You can go check them out yourself. But it indicates, Zero was trying to escape through this lobby, and Big Boss had kind of pinned him in there. And so Zero's troops come in, Cipher's troops come in and try to take down Big Boss, and that's probably why they're having all this hesitation and this kind of are we really going to do this kind of attitude that they get. It's not the first wave that has that attitude, but after the first wave's cleared out, Venom tries to run away, and then the helicopter that's been like sort of telekinesis shoved into the doorway. We have to jump out of the way of it, and a tank comes in and knocks it out of the way. So we've got the helicopter here, and it's crashed, and I think that's again, it's meant to be more like Ground Zero's context, and possibly, the whole walking down the steps and standing there that the man on fire is doing is maybe something that Chico saw after he had transformed, crashed into, because I think they did this over the base, so they transformed in midair and then probably would have crashed through the base, its structure, and then Big Boss probably walked downstairs and saw Chico, and that's probably where they started fighting. And so that's why it's depicted this way. It's sort of like that memory is mixed in here, I think, with what happened to Zero's decoy. So the scene also may have some relations, since it's related to the Fury and kind of going berserk and stuff like that. Maybe could be possibly telling us through code what happened to Dr. Clark. Maybe Chico at one point did a little Fury thing after he was sort of feeling attacked by a lot of stuff and then blew up. And that could be kind of like a hint as to what happened to Dr. Clark and how Dr. Clark died. I also want to speculate here that tank that comes in and fires at Volgin, it resists quite a bit of abuse from Volgin before it finally gets blown up. It seems like that tank could be a reference to Vulcan Raven in Metal Gear Solid. If Mantis is kind of a reference, or if Trettage is a reference to Mantis, then this tank coming in could be a reference to Vulcan Raven. I kind of like to think that what if Code Talker was piloting or commanding that tank, So if the scene where he does the explosion is kind of a Fury recreation, there's this other part where we get control back, right? And then we run away and we're knocked out. And there's, the helicopter's crashed there. I think this is all kind of a hint towards the end, essentially, and the end's parasite. And how this is kind of a recollection of the end of Ground Zeroes and kind of the end of Chico, really, as he existed as a human before he died and was sort of, I guess you could say, reborn or reconstructed as this sort of parasite version of him that became Venom Snake. But when we wake up after we're knocked over, we see this statue that's out in the front of the boss, and it's got the 4 wolves, I believe, on the corners of it, and it's burning and it's on fire. And this image is a very, very classic old symbolic image. It's the burning bush from the Book of Exodus, the burning bush that showed Moses a vision. Essentially, that's kind of what's going on here. I think it's implied that what we're seeing here with Volgin walking towards us is like a vision of something that's going to happen in the future of Metal Gear. Essentially, we're probably going to have to, if I had to guess, there's probably going to be some future game where they finally tell the story of all this redacted mutiny stuff, and at some point we'll probably see Big Boss walking towards us very scarily and very unstoppably, But again, with him getting Volgin standing there and then getting run over, kind of indicates that whatever happened inside the hospital spilled outside, and then Zero was picked up in some kind of motorized transport and then whisked away. And so it's more of the New York escape, but it's also the escape from MSF's base of Ishmael and Zero in the helicopter, and really all the stuff leading up to the crash, the stuff that happened after Chico had jumped out specifically. So the way that Ishmael's driving this ambulance away from the scene and Volgin's throwing stuff after him, you can imagine it's like if Morpho was sort of trying to get away from the scene while maybe Big Boss was there on the base. And, I've said before that Big Boss actually went after Zero in New York, but it's possible that Big Boss and Ocelot, maybe just Big Boss, was on the MSF base carrying all this stuff out. It's all symbolic, so it's kind of hard to say. But it seems like, the way Volgin's here throwing stuff after us indicates that maybe Big Boss was dealing with the Chico and the quiet stuff, and maybe some of the stuff flying out was, coming from that fight essentially. And then meanwhile, Snake and Zero are escaping in their vehicle. And then what happens is it gets shot by a helicopter. And we see the windshield breaks and Ishmael passes out. And he's not dead, but that lines up 1-to-1 with the cutscene in Mission 29 in Metallic Archaea, where when the windscreen is blown out of Pequod in the helicopter, we know the pilot's killed. So that's probably relating back to the Ground Zeroes incident. And what happened was, I'm sure the pilot was flying away, and then they got intercepted by a gunship and strafed with guns, and it probably killed the pilot, but didn't kill the passengers in the back. And then Ishmael probably tried to, regain control, and the thing just spun out and crashed. And all the rest of that stuff happens, kind of like we see here in the prologue with us waking up and Ocelot coming and getting us, and a further escape and stuff like that. That's and getting to the harbor. Probably relates to getting to the harbor in New York. This is all probably what happened. Although in New York it probably wasn't Ocelot with Zero. It probably would have been Eva, because I think, like I said in the earlier missions, Eva was probably the one who was his contact to get to this other place. And I keep saying Zero, but remember, it's a Zero decoy. It's just a guy that looks like Zero, and he's got this, this British accent. He's like the guy that we know as Zero, but he's not the real Zero. And the idea is that Big Boss thinks he's chasing after the real Zero, but it's just a decoy. So this little section, again, it's the end. It's New York, and it's MSF. The tunnel is also a big symbol. Comes from Metal Gear Solid 3, when Snake is escaping Ocelot and the dogs and all the guards in the underground. I think it's a sluice, or it's like a sewer, which that whole scene is kind of a recreation of that scene from The Fugitive, where Harrison Ford's character is being chased by Tommy Lee Jones's character, and he jumps off. Snake doing that jump off in Metal Gear Solid 3 is kind of a reference to that scene, but it happens in a kind of a similarly lit tunnel, and you'll notice the giveaway is on the roof or the ceiling of the mouth of this place. There'll be these multiple fans. These fan blades are like, exhaust fans or whatever, but they're there in this Dekelia's tunnel on both sides. They're in the Metal Gear Solid 3 Grozny Grad tunnel, and they're also in the tunnels. I guess you could say it's a tunnel. The hallway in the PT teaser trailer, not the real PT game, but in the PT teaser. After the camera turns to the right around the corner and sees, I'm guessing that's Chico's body, and this monster sort of taking his head off, I guess, or maybe sucking his brains out, something like that. The hand starts chasing after you, so the camera turns, goes the other way down the hallway, and at the end of the hallway, these three sort of fan vents, and it's meant to recall these fan vents from the tunnel here in this mission in Dekelia. Well, not recall, but I guess at that point it would have been a future reference to that. But it's recalling the fans from Metal Gear Solid 3 from the Grozny Grad tunnels. And I'm sure there's more symbolic meaning behind the fans that I'm not grasping. So go have fun with that yourself. So then the crash happens, and we see Ocelot pull out in the Truth mission Ishmael right after he wakes up. He wakes up first. And I think the whole Ishmael waking up first has symbolic relations back to how we're told both of them, Ishmael and Ahab, were in a coma for 2 years in that Truth tape, and neither one of them is woken. And I think it's like a hint as to which one of them woke up first. It was probably Ishmael. But that also, the coma thing, as we're told about the 2 years, there might be some kind of recontextualization in lies, because it's all on the tape and we can't really see what's going on. In other words, we can't trust that tape too much. But from what we see here in the crash, we can kind of corroborate some stuff. And it looks like this whole this crash, being a double sort of superimposition of what happened in New York and what happened before they got to New York, kind of implies that this is how the switcheroo was made from Zero and the decoy, that Zero woke up right after the crash and was maybe squirreled away somewhere by Eva, and then the decoy was left in place. So when Fox essentially woke up, Snake would wake up and then see this guy that looked just like Zero. So it's the same guy, right? But it's a decoy, and then would just treat him like the real thing. like maybe Eva didn't even let Fox know that this was a decoy of Zero at first. So it's to like help fool Big Boss and all this. So then what happens? So you have to put stuff together, but essentially, if you pay attention to the details, Ocelot goes and gets Ishmael out, takes him somewhere, says, this way, boss. And then not long after that, it must have been maybe it's possible that he was just like off in some little house somewhere nearby or just waiting in the woods. It's probably not really important. But then Ocelot would have had to have gone back to the crashed ambulance and get Ahab out. Now Ahab, wakes up on his own and gets himself out of the ambulance. But then he sees Tretage there when he looks up because the helicopter's still chasing after him. And Tretage does another thing where he pulls from Venom's memory and reenacts something. And that's when we see the flying whale come up and eat the helicopter and take it out of the sky. I think the flying whale is a big old symbol, and it's probably primarily a combination of the Moby Dick symbolism with the Sahelanthropus jump that we see in Mission 13, or 12. 12. In Hellbound, we have to shoot Sahelanthropus when it's jumping up at the helicopter. And that's probably something that Chico did after he was transformed, after he jumped out, blew up, transformed, hit the ground. At some point, he probably jumped up at the chopper. He was probably kind of mad. I don't know. Seems like he was maybe even just in a full rage, and wasn't really seeing straight. And he maybe he was the reason why the helicopter got taken down. It's interesting though. Maybe maybe it was Big Boss. I don't know. It's hard to kind of, like I say, it's hard to suss all these little symbols out because so many things are superimposed on one another. But I think that Sally's jump and the giant Chico that I've talked about kind of are reminiscent of this giant whale, the flying fire whale, and it coming up from out of the depths, sort of. And again, it's a thing that Mantis does after he looks at Venom. It's like Mantis is sort of pulling from Venom's memories, right? So that's how it maybe could be like the giant Chico stuff, kind of from 84 is possibly mixed in there with what happened back in 75. But we know the Sahelanthropus' jump is definitely there for probably the same reasons this flying whale is there. And then there's this unicorn Pegasus on fire that we see after the helicopter has sort of disappeared. Unicorn Pegasus on fire is because Pegasus is just a winged horse, but this is a unicorn Pegasus that's on fire, and it's got Volgan riding on it, and it's got Tretage in front of Volgan. That almost suggests to me that Big Boss took Chico and put him on a horse and then started chasing after Zero and Snake back in 75. And maybe that was what started the whole flight to New York thing, But the Unicorn Pegasus, I don't have enough time to go into that one, but there's a lot of symbolism kind of superimposed there with a Unicorn Pegasus on fire with two people riding it. But moving on, we escape Volgan, shoot him a bunch, and then hit the bridge. And while we're riding across the bridge, it's hit with the bolt of lightning. And I think that, again, relates back to the whole railgun and bridges and Volgan thing that I've talked about ad nauseum at this point. And it's like it's a bolt of lightning that kind of comes out of the blue, right? You would say when a bolt of lightning comes out of a blue sky, right? Because there's not like a storm going on; it's not raining. This whole idea of a bolt out of the blue is kind of like inspiration itself, like an epiphany. When you have an epiphany, it's like a lightning bolt hits you from kind of just out of nowhere, and you can't say where it comes from. And in the way, like I said, memory itself kind of is like a reaction. The memory recall process can be a reaction to seeing a thing, right? So I think that's kind of what's going on to create this little moment here. It's like a little inspiration coming from recall, which really occurs because of this gap in memory, right? So it's like the lost arm is sort of evoking this electricity. So then we fall into the river. Ocelot gets out on his own. Snake wakes up, like pulls himself out, and sees Tretich right in front of him, just doing a whole thing with the rain. And I think that's reminiscent of what Joy does right before Snake gets thrown off the bridge, when it's raining blood, and she's wondering if the Sorrow's there. Essentially, I think that Mantis probably has the Sorrow's DNA in his own, and so he can probably remember that moment if the Sorrow was really there and it was raining blood. I'm assuming. He's kind of recreating this moment. And also, if you've played Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Monsoon also recreates this exact same thing with the rain and his hands up and making this motion, of like the sorrow is just raining down, kind of. And the river that you fall into is evocative of the sorrow. So the sorrow itself, it's like I said, it relates to the mutiny's source, why it's happening, and and we've sort of been dumped into it here at the end as a way of symbolically being like, if you haven't gotten it yet, this is all happening because of sorrow, really. Now, I should also say, since we're out of the hospital, I don't think the whole genetics thing still applies. Like, I think this scene doesn't really depict another part of Venom's genetics in the same way all the rest of the stuff does. But if you want to look into it that way, feel free. I think it's perfectly valid to interpret these other scenes away from the hospital as maybe standing in for other parts of the genetics. But it gets very, very, for me, kind of tough to tie the other personalities in Cipher who have genetics that could be sort of related here. And I think there's only 12 really 12 genes, like I've said before. So if there's 8 that we've gotten already, then there should only be 4 left. But I don't know if we can pull 4 out of these last few scenes. It's kind of hard to say. If I could do it, I'd do it, but I couldn't figure it out myself. So y'all can have fun with that one if you want to. So then, now that we've gotten to the ending part, we need to talk about the 2 different endings. The first one that we experience is this scene with Ocelot in the prologue, and I kind of see this scene as Ocelot's lies, where he's really setting us up with a bunch of lies. And now he says, big boss, you know who I am. A certain man gave me a job to do. 2, actually. One was to save you, essentially. One was to get you out of there. And the second was to save the man himself. The way he says it and the way it's like kind of delivered, and the way the game, like, the cinematography and all goes, kind of makes us feel like the man himself is us, and that we kind of just forget this whole, like, rescue you part that he just said. In other words, he's kind of hinting at, he's just rescued you and this other guy who also looks like you. The man himself being like the man who sold the world. That's Ishmael. If you thought Ishmael was fake, well then, who's this other guy that Ocelot has rescued and all that stuff, I think it just doesn't bear itself out. I think it's silly that people even think that Ishmael wasn't there. I mean, Ocelot pulls him out of the freaking ambulance in the truth mission. I think you really have to strain credulity a whole lot to say Ishmael's just not there. So I won't entertain any of that. If any of you want to comment being like, Ishmael's really not there, I promise I'm not going to respond to you in the comments. Anyways, so what Ocelot's doing here is he's using his speech to just sort of subtly misdirect us. And then when he says rescue the man himself, we think he's kind of thinking we're talking about us, but then we remember, oh no, he just said rescue you and then the man himself. So then in the prologue, we don't know yet that he's actually done all this stuff with Ishmael. So what he does is he follows up the man himself with a misdirect and says, you remember 9 years ago, your partner Kazuhiro Miller. He's trying to imply that the man himself is Kaz, and that Kaz is the one who gave him the job to rescue you from the hospital. But that's not actually what's going on. He's sort of putting this implied link between the man himself and you remember 9 years ago Kaz Miller, but this whole idea of the man himself being Kaz Miller is something we do in our own minds, because of just conversational context. It's not actually what he means. You can interpret his sentence a different way, as if the man himself is just somebody, is Ishmael, essentially. And then Kaz is like sort of your next mission. He's just going to move on to it and act like it's sort of like what he was just talking about, but it's really a misdirect. He talks about how Kaz was, 4 years ago, he was training rebels. And all this stuff. It's kind of implying that if we think it's 84, then it's like, well, that happened in 80. But like I said, I think there's kind of some deceptions with the timeline going on here. And this 4 years ago reference, that one's probably kind of like the Code Talker 5 years ago reference. It's probably a hidden reference to some other stuff. I've speculated that this mission probably canonically happens in 1986. So 4 years ago would refer to 82, which would refer to right before Big Boss's fall. We'll get to the timeline. In 82, there's actually nothing in the timeline that's referenced. So it's kind of hard to say what he's talking about with this 4 years ago in the training rebels thing exactly. But it's probably a reference just to the mutiny. And how, like, the Kaz shell that replaced the original Kaz was training rebels, training, these mutineers, essentially, working with the bad guys. And 4 years ago points back to when the mutiny was still going on at this point, essentially. So I think that's what that all ties up as, but there's probably more references there, is what I'm trying to say, that are on top of that. Because Ocelot, more than anybody, will say one thing that means like everything, So you can't just take what he's saying on the surface more than anybody else. Then we get to the harbor, and he says there's this boat. It was an old whaling ship. After we've just seen the whale in the sky, and he said he got a good deal with it after the IWC raised a stink. Y'all, this is a big Metal Gear Solid 2 reference. About how, the whole thing stank, but our noses had been out in the cold for too long with the tanker mission. Like, this is the tanker mission. This is all kind of the same context. It's just hiding in plain sight, The whole thing here does stink, but our noses have been out in the cold for too long and we didn't smell it, right? And so that, like I said, I think Ocelot's just telling us all these surface level lies that have just a ton of other kind of hidden truths going on underneath it. But then to contrast with that scene, in the truth mission in Mission 46, we don't see that scene. We see the Ishmael version of it, which I think is more of like Ocelot's truths. And it's not just him lying to us, it's him telling us kind of some truths about what's going on so we can get some more hints as to all this, redacted stuff. So, again, how Ocelot is the one who pulls Boss out of the helicopter, or I should say the ambulance, being a reference to how the old man is pulled out of the helicopter in Metallic Archaea. Him being Ishmael being the old man here, and how this is probably where the swap happened, because the decoy will take your place, and he can handle it all and all that kind of stuff. The broken bridge is depicted in the background of this scene, which indicates this happens after Ocelot's secured Ishmael. After he secured Ahab. So he talks to Ishmael after Ahab's in the boat. Presumably, he puts Ahab in the boat and then leaves the boat because it's daytime, and probably says he's got to go get a couple of things, and then goes and meets with Ishmael here. And so the broken bridge is there kind of to symbolize, again, the broken connection, the mutiny, and the sort of the lost memories that we have to fill in ourselves. And there's also this lighthouse on the other end of it, implying that, there's sort of it's a beacon for directionality, right? To know where you are. If you can sort of make it across this bridge and span this gap, you can find this lighthouse. And that the lighthouse is another big symbol too. If you've played BioShock Infinite, you definitely know that already. But then Ocelot gives Ishmael this passport, and it's the name that you put in and the face that you put in at the beginning of the game. And I think this is your best, sort of indication that Ahab is Ishmael now. Essentially, he's saying, this is who you are now. You'll have to change your name and your face. And that's a way of saying, like, because his name and his face right now don't match the name and the face on this passport. So he's going to become the name and the face on the passport. That has layers and layers of meaning. So just think about that one. But I also want to mention some of the details on this passport. It's got the birthday that you selected, but then it's also got some other dates on there that you cannot control. The issue date for this thing is always April 14th, 1980, and the expiration date is always April 13th, 1986. So it has a 6-year-long elapsed date. Every 6 years you have to renew it. Essentially, it's like 5 full years, and then for the 6th year you've got to renew it. But this 1980 to 86 span, I think this, especially the 86 number, is kind of a hint as to when this is happening. We know this is definitely happening before 86 because we're going to assume this thing's not expired, but it could be happening like days before 4/13/86, maybe even like the day before. And he's like, oh, I got to go get this thing renewed now. And that's why he's got to change his face, And I think this date of 1980 could have, symbolic references back to maybe when, the 79 thing happened and the new sort of wave of Big Boss's whole schemes and Solidus switching sides in 79. Maybe 1980 is if Chico left and got a new identity with the Big Boss side of things. Maybe 1980, April 14th, around that time, was when he got that identity after 79, There's also a birthplace mentioned. And it says CA, California. That's a little weird. Anyways. Also, it also says, the whole world wants your head here. And it's never explained to us in this whole game why the whole world is after us. And I think it's like I said, if you put together all the stuff that this implies about what happened in New York in probably 76, Big Boss probably caused a big hubbub in New York and attacked Zero and all. Probably killed a lot of people. And his face was probably seen and captured on several photographs. It's probably kind of like a reference to the Terminator and how in that original Terminator event, there was all that carnage that was caused, and then the face of that Arnold Schwarzenegger T-800 was captured on a bunch of CCTV, and then it just kind of drops off the map until he shows back up in the 90s in Terminator 2. And that being like a whole, that gap, all the time travel stuff kind of, I think, ties in here. And then Ocelot gives him a cigar after he says, aren't you forgetting something? And that's probably a real Cuban cigar. In 86, I don't know if many people without connections with like communism, essentially in the world of communism, I don't know if they could have gotten a cigar. This is a thing I don't know as much about, but the history of how easy it's been for people to smuggle Cuban cigars out of Cuba into like America or communist parts of the world. It's kind of an interesting topic. You should go look into that yourself. There's certain time periods where it was like almost impossible to find a Cuban cigar in America because of just politics, essentially, but lots of stuff. Anyways, but I think the cigar is there kind of as like, it's a real cigar. And the cigar thing relates to how Chico wasn't allowed to smoke until he's older, and he's older now, essentially. So this is where he's really become hombre nuevo, but like his own man, not just like a new man who's given his life to this other dude. It's like he's kind of given his life to himself in a way, but himself is this other dude. So it's kind of both. Okay, I've already mentioned the lighthouse. Let's skip that. I also want to mention the direction of the camera in this last scene. It never shows Ishmael's face while he's speaking. And I'm going to call him Ishmael because I'm pretty sure this is Ishmael. The cutting doesn't indicate that there's some other dude that Ishmael just gets scrolled away and then Big Boss comes out. That doesn't make any sense, It makes more sense that Ishmael gets scrolled away, changes his face, that's the same guy. And I think that the big hint to that is that the camera never shows his face while he's speaking. It's always he's either off screen or it's behind his head or he's just somewhere where you can't see his face moving at all. The only time you really see his face is after Ocelot skedaddles. You see a little bit before that, but you don't get a great look at it. And I think that really good look that you get at it at the very end is meant to be like, it's you're not meant to understand it literally. You got to understand it symbolically. And so that's the end of my notes. Oh no, I've got another page. Yep, no, we got to skip. We got to talk about the timeline. Sorry. So right here, after this part happens and Ishmael drives off and it fades to black, this timeline pops up. Okay, and it shows a bunch of stuff from 1942 to 1984. And it's like, why is it showing the things that it's showing? It says it starts with 1942. Code Talker helps make the U.S. military Cipher book. Well, I got a theory for this one. Let me just throw it at you. I think that the original events for the Cobra's creation happened in 1944. That during essentially the Normandy siege, during that whole battle, a big portal opened and zombies started spilling out. And that's what caused the Cobra unit to get organized and sent through this portal and put on this mission. And while they were on this mission, they all died and were resurrected as like parasite versions of their old selves that had these new superpowers. But then they're in the future, and they have no way of traveling back because once they accomplish their mission, the wormhole connecting this place to the past where they came from would have closed. So if they came from 1944, I think that there's no way they could have gone back to their own reality unless they had gone back to a date after the time they had left. So they would have had to come back at like after June 6th, 1944, essentially. And they might have come back to their own reality. But since they had killed this thing that was doing all of this time travel stuff, it's also possible that they may not have been able to return to their reality at all. And so if that was the case, and I think that was the case because that's what Survive says was the case, when we kill the Lord of Dust, we can't go back to our reality. And since they're in the future, they'd have to travel back to the past. And so I think any traveling to the past would have essentially resulted in a new timeline being formed. And so I think because of that, they decide not to go back to 1944, but to go back to 1941. And if they go back to 41, they can kind of change the way that the war plays out by their own contributions. And I think that's why in 1942, we see this first entry of Code Talker helps make the U.S. military Cipher book. I think Code Talker is probably a reference primarily to Zero here. And this is like Zero helped the U.S. military make their whole Cipher book, not for operations in World War II, but probably for like all kinds of stuff beyond what we know that the Navajo speakers were doing, back in World War II. It's probably like more relating to not the literal U.S. military, but to the parasites version of America, right? So like that's probably when he sort of started all their stuff. And then nothing happens until 64. And then we see all this stuff in 64. And then there's a series of events from 65, 67, 68, and 69 that are talked about. And it's all this stuff from the Congo crisis and the China H-bomb test. And Eva's vanished in Hanoi. And the U.S. DoD ARPANET has sent its first message. This is all, I think, symbolically spelling out the evolution and the history of Cipher, actually. It's just using real-world events that really happened that we know of, and then combining them with all of the Metal Gear sort of in-universe events, and take it all together, and that's pretty much the whole history of Cipher. And so that's what I've been drawing from this whole time, where I've been kind of guiding all of this, referential stuff from. And so you can just go look at all of the timeline yourself and kind of start to figure it out. And then after this other cutscene plays, which I'm going to talk about here in a sec, you get more timeline from the rest of 84 all the way to 2014. And, y'all, there's a lot of stuff that's... I could probably talk about it quite a bit, like the Hungarian citizenship thing and how Hungary relates to Big Boss, Jack, and how it relates to Jack being brought back into the Cipher Collective and being allowed to have his own recognizance and his own ability to just make choices in life and not be a prisoner anymore. Hungary citizenship laws have been changed. I think that's relating to Jack probably. In 2010, after the Big Shell event, he was probably considered sort of like done with his therapy and he was allowed to go out and do his own thing. And we know that's when the Rising event happens as well and all that stuff. But it also provides some context as to how in 2014 he's kind of off the map at the beginning of the Guns of the Patriots scenario. He's been allowed to do his own thing essentially, and I think he's kind of like He's probably remembered everything he did in the past, and he's trying to get over it and decide what to do next. Because indications are Jack Ryden remembers what Big Boss Jack did. So that's a whole thing, though. And stay tuned for my next big theory videos. I'm going to go into that stuff even more in depth. But I wanted to talk about it here because it's just, you really can't get around it. Jack is Jack. But then, so I skipped over this scene that happens after that first part of the timeline, the mirror scene. And, oh gosh, this is just a lot more symbolism. So, the tape plays. Snake looks in the mirror and sees the face of the Avatar, right? And every time you look in the reflection in Pequod during the game, you'll see the Avatar's face. I think that given how the prologue is contextualizing the face stuff with the mirrors, it's kind of implied that there's this sort of idea that maybe Venom Snake's face was the face of the Avatar the first time we go through the game. We just saw it as Snake's face. Maybe the Snake face is kind of a hallucination. And we don't really earn the Snake face until we've gotten to the Truth mission, until we've gotten through the whole game. And we've unlocked the Avatar face as a way of selecting it, as a way of saying we've really earned the face of Snake now, which is, kind of a double speak way of thinking of it, or double think way of thinking of it. But also this scene too, when he's looking in the mirror, is when we see this memory of Snake and the medic and Chico over pause. I think this is an implanted memory. I think this is our programming, and that we see it when we do, and then it fades out, and then it comes back up to the tape with Ishmael's voice playing as more sort of like contextualization for what we're supposed to do with this false memory that we've just recalled. This whole, now do you remember who you are and what you're supposed to do, I think is all, it's more symbolism. It's not, there is literal stuff there too, obviously, but like the visuals of what we're seeing, like I said, of all of that memory part, this medic person who has the Avatar's face, is kind of like, it's a self-creation, right? It's not really the real us. The only two real us's that I would think of, are Snake and Chico. It was probably just Snake and Chico there, and this medic person is kind of like a recontextualization that's there to sort of stand in for all of the stuff that Chico did that has to be redacted, essentially, or that can't be fully sort of grasped at the moment. But it also, again, has to do with like the whole delineation between Skullface being a little bit Big Boss and a little bit the Skullface role, and how that he's able to sort of take some of the bad legacy of Big Boss and put it with this Skullface persona and leave the Big Boss legend kind of a little less dark, essentially, after he's done with it. I also want to note that there's these, while Ishmael's talking to Ahab over the tape, the image in the mirror changes from the Avatar face to the Ahab with the hospital and the bandages. And, these are, I think, kind of meant to recall all the different times of Venom's life. And so there's the face with the bandages that we see, and then it pans away from the mirror, and then when it looks back, he's back to the normal Snake face that we're used to, and he's got the little horn. And I think you should note here, even if you are a full-on demon, he's always got the little horn here in this cutscene. It's like, this is Ahab. This is always Ahab in this scene. And we kind of are Ishmael talking to ourselves here, in a way. It's like our future self talking to our past self. You can imagine it's like you're talking to your past self who did the prologue back when you first started the game, I also want to note, this is a really good opportunity to check out Venom's eye color. When he says, I am Big Boss, from here on, you're Big Boss. Venom has this kind of realization and kind of this locking eyes with himself, with his own reflection, You get a good look at his eye color, and it's not blue. It's this kind of teal, blue-green color. And, I've talked a lot about that net color kind of relating to the Seleno Yarsk and the power of the parasites and all of that. So then he takes this tape, he turns it over to the side B. And we see it's, Intrude N3, Operation Intrude N313. Although we only see the N31, And it should be noted that N312 was the designation for the game when Kojima was first. Actually, maybe not when he was first assigned to it. It might have still been N312, but essentially when the game was first created by Konami, conceptually it was supposed to be a sort of a clone of the game Commando, which was made by Capcom, which itself was inspired by the movie Commando, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was kind of a run-and-gun, vertical scrolling shooter, kind of fast-paced deal. MSX couldn't handle it, and so the N312 Commando sort of prototype or project or whatever got iterated into N313, and that was what became Metal Gear. And that's why it's Intrude N313, because it was originally named Intruder, as like a way of differentiating it from Commando. But they kept that Intruder kind of concept name until they finally kind of reworked it into Metal Gear, once they had all the story stuff, But here it's a self-reference. Metal Gear is inside Metal Gear, right in front of our eyes. Like, we've kind of had some self-references in past Metal Gears, but this is probably the most explicit, showing us, like, we know this game's events, Metal Gear 1 is supposed to happen after the Phantom Pain's events, and everybody's thinking of it the whole time, and then here it is. And we learn that Venom knows it as well. So it's another hint that Venom and the player are essentially the same person, And all this stuff about Ishmael and Ahab can kind of be related also to the player and your in-game avatar of Venom Snake. It's like you can imagine Ahab's listening to Ishmael's voice there as like the in-game character listening to the player's voice, And this all kind of relates to how, this is all about self-creation. Self-reference and self-creation is what's been going on here. This whole rigmarole that I've been explaining all this stuff. These are all self-references to, both the past events and, parts of oneself and all that, recreated in kind of dramatic fashion, externalized as a way of just understanding that which has been lost. And so then after Ahab plays this tape, he walks back over to the mirror, and now he's a full-on demon. He's got the full horn and the bloody face. It's not a little horn anymore. And so this implies that a lot of time has gone past, that he's gone out and he's become a demon and done all that stuff. And I think that goes back to how, like I said in the last part 1, how Ishmael's words are kind of a hint pushing you to become a demon, like you're really supposed to fully explore this game. And, to 100% and platinum it, you need to develop a nuke. And anytime you develop a nuke, you're probably going to become a demon. So I think, it's just a way of saying, don't limit yourself, essentially. It's just a game, right? You need to explore all of the symbolism that's there. It's a way of saying, like, even though this history's been redacted, you shouldn't try to just ignore it. Like the erasing of the history doesn't mean it's bad and should never be brought back up. It actually probably means the opposite in this case. It's probably erased as a way of giving us a goal, essentially, to go towards. And so the mirror itself kind of represents the game itself. When you're sitting here playing this game, you're staring at a screen the whole time, right? And you're kind of seeing your own reflection back. What you're doing is reflected in the movements in the screen and everything, and what you're thinking and all that kind of stuff kind of comes from the game. And there's kind of this mirrored relationship that you have with it. And so all of this game's kind of false narratives and false surface level lies that I've been laying out that are actually there as symbolic truths, those are kind of like this distortion of the mirror. How a mirror can distort reality and it shows you a flipped version of reality, and how I've said how north is literally south here, and how some stuff that's on the left or on the sort of the west side of our base is on the east side of the Afghanistan map, and so on and so forth. It's like things are kind of mirrored and upside down. In order to really see things straight yourself, you got to smash that mirror. And so that's why when he smashes the mirror, he doesn't see his mirror image on the other side. He sees another version of himself. And then that other version of himself turns and walks into these mists. And I think that kind of recalls Silent Hill. And how, like, walking into the mists is like walking into your own little Silent Hill. And I've said this in my video, the bigger video series, that how I think this ending kind of is symbolic of us carving our own path through an uncertain future in Metal Gear, where like everything is symbolic, and it's kind of literally up to us to make something of everything. And so in that way, if you don't understand something, it'll be reflected back at you in the way like in Silent Hill, the character's own misunderstandings of reality and emotional stuff and things like that is manifested as monsters in the world that come and attack you, you know? And I think it's kind of like, you know, you can manifest monsters in Metal Gear by misperceiving it, essentially. And then we get a little post-credits scene after all the credits roll, and Ocelot's talking with Miller about, you know, all this stuff. But remember how Kaz is kind of a symbol really primarily for Hideo. That was where we started out with him, right? And so you could think of this as Hideo talking about how he's lost it all and about how, you know, he's kind of gone from Metal Gear now, right? And I think a lot of Kaz's words here are kind of meant to be symbolic of how Hideo's sort of saying, you know, screw Big Boss, I'll make this Phantom guy stronger, who's kind of like representative of the new players, right? Kind of like saying, I think maybe Hideo grew a little bit tired with the way his interactions went with the fans in Metal Gear for all of those years, and how all this stuff has kind of gone completely unseen and you know, not really talked about a lot. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way Western audiences in general perceive media. I mean, look at the way David Lynch is treated in Hollywood for the way he does mostly symbolic stories. I don't want to call him a pariah necessarily, but pariah-esque maybe. You know, the way people reacted to Twin Peaks was with a lot of love and stuff like that, but that's not how people have reacted to every single one of his works. If you go back to when Eraserhead came out, I think that movie was widely misperceived because I don't think most people knew what the heck to think of it at all. You know, it's kind of a you know, labyrinthine kind of plot. You know, it's a little bit of an apocryphal image, you know, grouping of images. It's kind of hard to figure that one out, right? I think the same can kind of be said for like Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway and some of his other stuff. Blue Velvet's maybe less so, but you know, using symbolism and heavy symbolism in works and depicting the literal or the symbolic as literal is not something that's super common in Western media or just in Western ways of life, you know? And that has to do with just Western, sort of like our mythological way of looking at the world in the West versus how most of the rest of the world has always looked at things in a mythological lens. But that's, again, another huge, long lecture that we don't have time for now. We're trying to finish this one up. So, again, you know, think of this conversation between Ocelot and Kaz a little bit as a conversation between, you know, the remaining Kojima Productions people and then Kojima having, you know, their split and all of that. But it's also a little bit, you know, since Ocelot is Adam and Kaz is kind of just this empty suit, you could think of Adam as like, you know, he's kind of the unique, you know, man. He's like, because Ocelot's kind of the unique guy in this you know, in Metal Gear, right? But he's always himself as well. He pretty much almost never will take on a disguise. And Adam, you know, kind of mythologically being, you know, the first man kind of gives him a certain uniqueness, right? And then Kaz being just whoever the commander is, right? Like I've said, how he's kind of maybe a replaced shell kind of implies that he's more of just a suit. Like he's just kind of an empty suit. So you could think of this also as like a conversation between someone who looks at the series with their own perspective versus somebody who looks at the series just on the surface and just kind of with what they're given and kind of just is just looking at the shell of the thing, right? And isn't really seeing all the way through it. There's a few ways to see this last little scene, but mostly I think it's I like to think of it as this is what Hideo's saying about Metal Gear's future. It's just kind of hidden in code here. And with that said, that's all the notes I've got on Mission 46 and Mission 0, y'all. It's a heck of a mission. It probably takes place, like I said, in 86 for the first time for Ahab, and then probably takes place again sometime later. It's implied that it's, you know, it also happens for Solidus probably sometime in between when Venom's two versions of it are, you know, and I didn't really mention it, but we'll get to it next time. There's a symbol, an image that we saw here at the ending that stands also for time travel, and it's kind of depicted right in front of our face with just symbolic language, and it's kind of hidden. But I think with what's going on with missions 47 through 50, and then this image, you can kind of put it all together and say Ishmael has traveled back in time after this. So we'll get to that next time. That'll be the last lecture. I'll kind of go over those 4 missions real quick, and kind of wrap up all the timeline stuff and do a neat little trick, hopefully. Well, I won't do the neat little trick. I'll expose a neat little trick that Kojima did with this game's story and its structure. So anyways, that's the end of this one. Like I said, next time I'll talk about more time travel stuff. You'll have to tune in next time if you want to really get the lowdown and the skinny on that. But I hope you all have enjoyed. Have a nice night. Peace.